For many of us, though, myself included, fear is more than circumstantial. Fear is just an ever-present companion in life, day in and day out. So I'll tell you just a little bit about my story. 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with something called generalized anxiety disorder. And to make a long story short, my brain is broken in such a way that fear is ever present. And it's awesome. But through those 20 years, God has taught me a lot about dealing with fear, about how to do so from a biblical perspective, and I mean relentlessly biblical. You're going to see that in this series. 6 weeks on fear, and here's my goal, that we actually break free of fear in our lives, that we bust fear as much as possible using God's word and God's truth. Are you interested in doing that? Okay. So, let's get started with a quiz, okay? There's all kinds of different fears out there, many, many different kinds, and many fears get names, right? Something phobia. And so I wanted to throw out a few of the most interesting ones that I've found and see if you can guess what they are, okay? All right, so here's the first one, Paganophobia. Paganophobia. Fear of pagonas. I don't know what those are, but they sound fearsome to me. No, this is the fear of beards. So to anyone in the room that suffers from paganophobia, I say to you, boo. All right, what about this one? Globophobia. Sorry, what was that? Traveling. Fear of traveling. It's a pretty good guess. This is actually the fear of balloons. Don't go to parties if this is you. Globophobia, fear of balloons. Okay, what about this one? Xanthophobia. Xanthophobia. Sounds like an instrument. Yeah, kind of does. This is the fear of the color or the word yellow. So if any of you has this fear right now, don't look at the screen. Okay, what about this one? Nomophobia. Nomophobia. I think more of us in this room have this phobia than we want to admit. Nomophobia. Fear of long sermons. You know what? Just for that, I'm going to pause. Everybody settling into this moment. Just wrap yourself in it. This is what I got to deal with 24/7. Nomophobia is the fear of being without your phone. Okay, last one. Oh, no, not the last one. I'm sorry. I got a bonus one for you. Here we go. Omphalophobia. Omphalophobia. Anyone? No? Okay, here we go. Fear of belly buttons. If you take your attention to the screen, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to show you belly buttons. Here's the last one, truly. Here we go. Hippopotamonstrosesquipadellophobia. Hippopotamonstrosesquipadellophobia. I say that twice because I practice pronouncing that for you. This is the fear of long words. Which is so mean if you think about it. It's like, what's your phobia? I can't say. Man, that's so mean. Lots of fears out there. Here's the thing, though. For us to really do this, okay, we got to think about what fear really is. So I've got a definition for you, all right? And I'm going to hit this every single week, probably multiple times a week. Here's what fear is, okay? We got to understand it if we're going to bust it. Here's what fear is. Fear is a habit of thinking. It's a habit of thinking that links present possibility with future catastrophe and leaves God out. Okay? I'm going to say that one more time. Fear is a habit of thinking that links present possibility with future catastrophe and leaves God out. That's fear. Fear is, I say this to say, fear is not the same thing as feeling afraid. Okay? Everybody feels afraid, and the goal of this series is not to never feel afraid again. That's not the goal. The goal is to stop the process that begins with feeling afraid. I'm going to kick this bottle off anywhere. That starts the process with feeling afraid and continues on to a habit of thinking that links present possibility with future catastrophe and leaves God out. That cycle, that loop of thinking that becomes fearfulness in our minds and in our hearts, our goal is to bust that up, okay? So in order to have that conversation, though, today, we have to begin with a question, all right? For us as Christians, we have to begin with a question. This is the first question that we got to deal with, because if we don't, none of the discussion we have after that really matters, and it's the title of today's sermon, Will God Keep Me Safe? Will God keep me safe? And if you've been a Christian for any period of time, you know that the answer to this question is a little more complicated than we'd like to admit. But if we are going to be people who live truly fearless, we have to deal with this question, which is what we're going to do today. So to do that, turn to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 8, okay? I'm going to give you a main thing. I'm going to give you a main thing, and it's not going to sound correct completely, but we'll get there, okay? Here's the main thing, all right? No one is safer than the Lord's people, even in the most frightening of times, okay? No one is safer than the Lord's people, even in the most frightening of times. Will God keep me safe? Got to deal with this. We're going to do it by looking into a story here in 2 Kings chapter 6. This is the prophet Elisha, right? With an S. Elisha and his sidekick, his servant. He doesn't even get a name in the story, so we'll call him sidekick, okay? Elisha and his sidekick, and they are, of course, prophets to Israel, and then there's this big superpower called Aram, and we're about to see that conflict play out. So let's begin reading 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 8. Now, the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. Which you might think is kind of oddly unspecific for the Bible, but just because it's illustrating for you something that happens over and over and over again. The man of God, that's Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel. Okay, that's a logical conclusion. They always know where we're going to be. Somebody's telling them, right? He just doesn't know that it's God. Verse 12, none of us, my lord the king, said one of his officers, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. That's not good. Go find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back. He is in Dothan. That's where Elisha is. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, you know, after he made his coffee, he's opening the door to get the Dothan Times. This is how I read the Bible. An army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Okay, here's number one in your notes. There are real fearful things in this life. Okay, this is Elisha and his sidekick. They're in Dothan. Just so we know, the army of Israel, which would be on their side, is in Samaria. So it's Aram's massive force surrounding Dothan, and right in the middle is Elisha and his sidekick dude. Do you understand why his sidekick's freaking out? Okay. This is just to say there are real fearful things in life. Some fears are irrational. Not all of them are irrational, and we have to mention this and settle in with this. There are frightening things in this life. Many times, in your notes, many times being afraid makes sense. Many times being afraid makes sense because fearful things happen. You're headed to the doctor and all the possibilities are the scary ones. Well, of course you're afraid. You don't know where the next check is coming from. Well, of course you're afraid. You're feeling fear. That makes sense. Someone brings legal trouble to your doorstep. That's a fearful thing. Anyone who's living in Ukraine right now could teach us about this. You think they're feeling afraid? Here's my point. Nobody would ever look in their face and say, fear is just this thing that you make up. Just nothing is a fearful thing. That's how you become fearless. That is not how you become fearless. You do not become fearless by pretending like there's nothing to be afraid of. That's not the reality. There are real fearful things in this life, and we have to say that right at the outset because this sidekick of Elisha would agree with you. He just had his morning orange juice, and now he's looking at an army surrounding him. Of course he's afraid, and many times being afraid makes sense. But let's read on to the next verse and hear Elisha's response to really get a sense of what this second lesson here is. Elisha tells him, "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." That makes absolutely no sense. Look at the situation. Elisha and the sidekick. Sidekick just had his toast. And he looks out the window, and there's an army dead aiming at them, surrounding the entire city. And Elisha says, "Don't worry, we've got more on our side than they do on their side." A strong force, an army with horses and chariots. It's you and me, man. Who are you looking at? Like, this is the reality of the situation. So here's number two. Listen, I may be afraid, but I'm never alone, okay? I may be afraid, but I'm never alone. We feel fear. We need to understand how Elisha's looking at the situation. I may be afraid, but I'm never alone. Here's number one underneath that. God has always promised to be with those who are afraid. God has always promised to be with those who are afraid. Let's look at a few different scriptures here. I want to show you Psalm 34, okay? You look at Psalm 34 with me. In Psalm 34, verse 4, we see this. "I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears." And then skip ahead to verse 7 in chapter 34. "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them." Okay, this is a truth that Elisha would have been familiar with, but let's look at another one. Let's look at Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41, verse 10. Some of you have this verse memorized, and you really should, because it's a good one to have memorized. It says this, "So do not fear, for I am," finish that phrase, "with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Do not fear, for I am with you." Okay, one more. Let's look at Deuteronomy 31:6. Deuteronomy 31:6. Heard this one before potentially. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them." And then the reason is given. "For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." Okay. Here's number two in your notes. It is not the absence of fearful things, but the presence of a faithful God that can make us fearless. is not the absence of fearful things, but the presence of a faithful God. There are real fearful things in life, and the answer to not being so deeply affected by them, to living fearlessly, is not to systematically eliminate everything in my life that makes me afraid. That's not going to work. There are always real fearful things in life, and the answer then is not to shrink them down and pretend like there's not as much to be afraid of. We like to do this in life too. We're looking at the possibility of a diagnosis that's terrifying us, and sometimes I like to power up over that. It's like, no, I got this. I got it. This diagnosis has got nothing on me, man. It's never faced me before. I'm going to fight it. Except the day's going to come where that mentality is going to fail you because it will be too much for you. And on that day, I hope that you know this truth. It's not the absence of fearful things, but the presence of a faithful God that can make us fearless. Why? Number 3, God's presence outnumbers the enemy. This is what Elisha knew when he's talking to his servant. This is the truth that he knew. He could see something Elisha couldn't see, and he could see this reality. That it didn't matter what was out there. It didn't matter what the thing was. It didn't matter what the fear thing was. The truth that he knew was God is with us. God's with me. And if God's with me, then it doesn't matter what's out there. Whatever's out there is outnumbered compared to my God. Okay? This is what he knew, and he's about to demonstrate that as we continue on in the story. Okay, 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 17. And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Okay, first off, that's really cool. Secondly, it's interesting. Here's what's interesting to me about this, is that if you read the rest of the story, and we're going to here in a little bit, if you read the rest of the story, that army doesn't really do anything. They do, they're there, they're present, but it's not like that army goes and fights the army of the Arameans. That doesn't happen. Elisha solves the problem, or God solves the problem through Elisha in a different way, but they're there. And it made me think of something that I think is very important for us to know, all right? If we're asking the question, will God keep me safe? We have to think about this. Here's number 3. God's protection is always present, even if it isn't activated. Okay? God's protection is always present, even if it isn't activated. If I'm thinking, okay, there are real fearful things in life, right? And then I know that God is on my side, so that I truly have nothing to fear. Why? Because my God is with me. It's his presence that makes the difference. If I'm recognizing that, then it's going to come up. The question's going to happen in my mind. If God is with me, why didn't he protect me? Because here's the reality. Stuff gets through God's line of protection. Does it not? I'll prove this to you. How many of you in this room have ever been hurt by something or someone in this life? Okay. Was God protecting you? Not from that. You might wish that he had. See, a lot of times we wish that God's protection functioned differently than it does. I wish that God's protection in my life were more like a giant fortress that's built all the way around me, like impenetrable, so I can truly go through life fearless. That's how I think I would be fearless, if I knew that I could walk through life and nothing could touch me. Then what would I have to fear? I would have nothing to fear, except that's not God's protection, right? I think a lot of times, I've said it before, but I think a lot of times we experience God's protection a little more like a flak jacket, right? I had a friend who fought in the Iraq War. He told me a story. It was so terrifying and interesting. Long story short, he got hit by a sniper rifle. Right here. His vest, his armor stopped the bullet barely, but stopped it. But he told me about his experience of getting hit with it, because I was in the movies, I'm like, they get hit by something, and then they fall over and maybe lose consciousness for a little bit, but then they always take the shirt off. Why do they do that? It's like, oh, I just needed to show the camera that I have a flak jacket on. And then they get up and keep chasing the guy. And my friend was like, no, that's not how it works. He says, I broke 7 ribs. It says, I had a bruise as big as my torso for 3 weeks. He says, I was totally incapacitated for almost that entire time. He goes, that is what it's like to get hit with a bullet when you have a flak jacket on like that. He says, it knocked me clear on my back. I think God's protection is a lot like that sometimes. Don't you agree? I go into this life and I'm hoping that God's gonna protect me from stuff, and then I get hit with something. Something gets through the line of protection and I think, you're not protecting me, except that's not correct theology, right? So that's why we're talking about that today, because the reality of it is that he is protecting me. He's just not protecting me the way I would like to be protected. I would like to be protected where I don't have anything, I come through unscathed, but that's not how the Christian life works. There are real fearful things in this life, even for the Christian, right? Do Christians get sick? Yes. Do Christians get sick and die? Yes. Do Christians have severe difficulty in marriage? Yes. Do divorces happen sometimes even if one of the people is fighting for that marriage tooth and nail? Yes. Do things happen to our kids? Yeah. Yeah, they do. Sometimes we're in a situation where you got to rush our kids to the emergency room. That happens to us. Do Christians lose their jobs? Yes. Christians lose their jobs. So what do we do with this? How in the world am I supposed to live a fearless life when God's protection works more like a flak jacket? I'm getting hit. I'm getting hit out there. I don't really know what to do with that. Okay, God's protection is always present even if it isn't activated. Here's number 1 underneath number 3. God's purpose dictates his protection. God's purpose dictates his protection. Okay, what's God trying to do here? God's purpose dictates his protection. I'll illustrate this for you by taking you directly to one of the most significant periods, one of the most significant nights in human history, Matthew chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus is in the garden. He has just finished praying 3 times over that God would find a different way to deliver humanity from sin and death. He's like, man, can you do this any other way? Is there any other way to get this done? 3 different times, ask God for that. 3 different times also says, your will be done. He knows what's ahead for him. And then the force shows up to arrest him. And I want to point your attention to verse 50. So he's talking to Judas. He says, Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And then this. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Sound familiar? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? Okay. Jesus in the garden has at his disposal 72,000 angels who did nothing. Jesus didn't get protected. He got arrested and beaten and stabbed and mocked and crucified. But it's verse 54 that we need to hang on to. Verse 54, right here. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? Okay, why did the 72,000 receive the order from God to stand their ground and not do anything? When Jesus himself is being mistreated in the garden, can you imagine if you're an angel in that army? You're like, you're mistreating my Lord. Like, I want to encourage the guy who whipped the sword out. Are you kidding me? And they're standing by. Why? Because there was a different purpose. God was doing something bigger. In fact, we can say this. The only time that God doesn't protect me from a particular danger is when he's protecting me from an even greater one. You understand? He is protecting you. The only time he doesn't protect me from a present danger in my life and I get hit and feel the pain and have to endure everything that comes with it is when he's actually working to protect me from an even greater danger. You say, how does this work? Well, listen, why didn't Jesus get protected? Because we needed salvation. That's why. But in our own lives, you think, man, like, why in the world did these things happen the way they did? What if God in his wisdom has allowed certain things to come through and hit you, and it's because he's protecting you from the greater danger of weak faith? I might not agree with God that that's a greater danger in my life, but is it a greater danger over time? And he knows that if he allows this thing to come through the line of protection, that it will result in, as James says, perseverance, hope, all of these things. Of course that he's doing that. What if he knows by allowing this particular thing, he's protecting me from self-reliance? A greater danger of self-reliance, of me and my prideful sin, thinking that I can handle this life on my own without God. What if that's going on? Do we think that's possible? Is that a greater danger than other things typically are? Yes. God is willing to allow a lot of things to get through the line of protection. What if he's protecting me from hard-heartedness? Okay, really quickly here. Number 2, God always has a plan. And number 3, the plan is good, even when stuff gets through God's line of protection. Do we believe this morning? Even when I get hit, do we believe this? The plan, God has one, and it's good. God has a plan, and it's good. Yeah, but I got hurt. I know. God has a plan, and it's good. Do we believe this? We have to believe it if we are going to take the first step of living a fearless life. Or else this very question, will God keep me safe, is going to keep me locked up and paralyzed and not able to walk forward in faith for the rest of my life. I got to know that I can trust God and how he decides to protect me, not how I want to be protected, because he always has a plan, and the plan is good even when stuff gets through. There's one more thing we got to understand. So let's go back to 2 Kings chapter 6. Elisha has opened the servant's eyes. Now he sees what he couldn't see before. But look at how this works out. This is so interesting. Verse 18. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike this army with blindness. So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Now, as you're about to see, this isn't like traditional blindness the way that we understand it. Elisha told them, this is not the road and this is not the city. Follow me and I will lead you to the man you are looking for, says the man you're looking for. Sorry, but do we have any Star Wars fans in here? This is a Jedi mind trick. It's even worded like one. I wonder if George Lucas took the idea from the story. This is not the road. This is not the city. Follow me and I'll lead you to the man you're looking for. And he led them to Samaria. What's in Samaria? The Israelite army. This is how he's getting this done. Okay, verse 21. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them? Do not kill them, he answered. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Ever gracious is God, right? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master. So he prepared a great feast for them. Interesting strategy. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. Okay, now I'm going to give you what I call the Joseph principle. You're going to see why I call it that in a minute. God will only let the enemy accomplish the exact opposite of what he intends. God will only let the enemy accomplish the exact opposite of what he intends. How does he do this? Right there, God superintends the intention of the enemy. What was the army from Aram trying to do? They were trying to capture Elisha, right? That's their purpose. That's what they were sent to do. That's what they were trying to do. What ended up happening? They got captured. It's the exact opposite of what they were trying to do. It wasn't even that they didn't find him and then left, because God hid him. Like, no, God worked it out so that what happened was the opposite of what they were trying to do. God likes to do this with the enemy. This isn't the only place that something like this has happened. Let's go to Genesis chapter 37 together. Genesis chapter 37. This is why I call it the Joseph principle. In the story of Joseph, Joseph had some not miraculous, but had some fantastic dreams, and he decided to tell his brothers about it. And his brothers got jealous, so they sold him into slavery. It's a little intense. Intending to leave him for dead. But I want you to hear how Joseph interprets all of this. This is Genesis 37. Starting in verse 16. He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are, grazing their flocks? They moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to, okay, wait a minute. We've seen this town before. Dothan. It's another Dothan story of God's protection. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Fast forward to chapter 50. In verse 18, we see this. His brothers then came, right, a reuniting after many years. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, as Joseph's now in charge of Egypt, basically, second only to Pharaoh. We are your slaves, they said, but Joseph said to them, and here it is, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Okay, do you see this principle at work? You intended to what? Harm me, but God intended it for good. That's what I mean when I said that God superintends the intention of the enemy. The enemy is intent on destroying you, which means that no matter what happens, what's going to happen? You will not be destroyed. You will prosper. You will grow in faith and trust in God. Right? Jesus even made sure of this, right? Because the fact of the matter is, the fact that Jesus was not protected in the garden means that you and I are protected from the greatest possible danger that is out there for us. You know what the greatest possible danger is for you and me? The greatest possible danger for you and me is to fall into the hands of Almighty God with no mediator, standing before him in my own sin, without the sacrifice and life of Jesus to cover me. That's the greatest danger that's out there for me. And if I have given my life to Jesus, if you are there in this room and you have given your life to Jesus too, then God has already protected you from the greatest possible danger there is. an eternity without him. Everything else is about sanctifying you and making you holy and look more like him. So this is the question I have for you, family. Can God be trusted? Let's say that a little more firmly. Can God be trusted? Can he be trusted to decide exactly how to protect us? Yes. He has already worked to protect us from the greatest possible danger that there is. And so we know that in this life, either he's going to guard me from the danger, or he is going to allow the danger because he's protecting me from a greater one, because he is good and he can be trusted. But we have to start here. We have to start here if we're going to live lives of fearlessness. We have to begin here. Will God keep me safe? Well, yes and no. That depends a little bit. Ultimately, absolutely. But in this life, he gets to decide what the protection looks like. And there are times where we disagree on what that protection should be. But the truth of the matter is, no one is safer than the Lord's people, even in the most frightening of times. Why? Because we have been protected from the greatest possible danger there is. And everything else, God will decide in his wisdom. We have to begin in this place if we are even going to begin talking about living lives that are fearless. As we open up the word in the coming weeks, we're going to talk more about the specificities of fear and how to combat them in our everyday lives. But we got to start here. Will God keep me safe? Ultimately, yes. So he can be trusted. He can be trusted to decide what the protection looks like. And sometimes he allows it to pass over me. And other times he allows it to come into my home. But no matter what the decision is, we can look at Jesus on the cross, the one who wasn't protected, and see the goodness of our God who can decide how we're protected. True? All right. We've got another song to sing. We've got another song to sing, so I'm going to ask Matt and his team to come back up. What I love about this song, it's kind of an older Chris Tomlin song. So because it was written by Chris Tomlin, you know that it's holy. But what I love about this song is that the insistence that I have nothing to fear comes from one place and one place alone, and it is my deep friendship with God. His presence in my life, his provision of salvation, and his closeness with me. It's got nothing to do with the circumstances. There could be all kinds of fearful things going on, but I know that I can be fearless because the God who is all-powerful is with me, and I trust him implicitly. And the first step in becoming someone who is truly fearless is trusting him. He decides what the protection looks like. Elisha knew it, so he could see the chariots of fire. Because he knew we're either going to be protected from this or through this, because the God of angel armies is on our side. Trust that God this week and whatever you're walking through. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, help us to trust your protection in our lives. Though we wish it were different frequently, give us hearts of faith to trust that no matter what, you're always protecting us, whether from the danger in front of us or greater danger we can't see. As we believe and trust in you in that way, fill us with confidence this week as well. As we walk from this place and serve you in the different places that you've called us to this week, we thank you. It is in Jesus' wonderful name that we pray. Amen.